Everyone, Virgo Triad here. It is January 9th, 2018. Good morning to everyone. And while we are on the subject of debt consolidation in the debt consolidation series of validating your debts through the collection agencies attempting to collect on them, I had mentioned to you in the previous video that there was some hot water you could possibly find yourself in if this is not done properly. So due to that, it's very important that you understand the potential reactions that are created when you're sending a debt validation letter on valid debts. So if you feel that your debt isn't valid and this information, it's not going to apply to you in that case. If you feel that your debt is truly not valid, you need to go ahead and send the debt validation letter. In the event that you know that the debt is valid and you're going to play the odds to attempt to see whether or not they will validate your debt, then you need to know this information. First off, I want to go ahead and play you a short video that was made by a woman called Heather Allen. She is an attorney for the Division of Finance Practices for the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And this is just a very short 1-minute video on what has been found statistically with regards to actual debt consolidation or debt consolidation attempts based upon validating the debts through the collection agencies that attempt to collect. So just take a listen here, and then we'll go into more detail with regards to what you could expect if you attempt to validate a valid debt.
We also took a look at how often debt buyers verify debts that consumers disputed. As you know, under the FDCPA, if a consumer disputes the debt in writing within 30 days of receiving a validation notice, the collector must cease collection efforts on the debt until the collector obtains verification of the debt. In our study, the debt buyers reported that they verified about half of all disputed debts. They were more likely to verify debts attained from the original creditor as opposed to other debt buyers. They were less likely to verify debt that was more than 6 years old compared to debt that was less than 3 years old. And they were less likely to report verification of medical, telecommunications, and utility debt as compared to credit card debt. Some caveats about this verification rate data. The Commission itself did not determine that the debts are verified. These are all self-reported rates of verification by the buyers, and the Commission does not know what the buyers did to verify the debts.
Once again, that was Heather Allen, an attorney who works for the Federal Trade Commission in the Division of Financial Practices. And she's explaining that per the Federal Trade Commission's report, debt buyers verify and dispute about 50% of the time. Now, in my experience, the lack of response from the collection agencies is that it's generally related to one of two things. One is if they feel that you are uncollectible, they may not find it personally beneficial to bother with validating the debt. And two, it is possible that they may not be able to validate it. Now remember, that's a 50-50 odd there. Your odds are 50-50 that they may not be able to validate it, or they may not feel that you're collectible enough based on the information that they have with regards to income and work experience and previous credit profile documentation. You may not be worth their while. It also may be that the debt is approximately 5 to 6 years old, and therefore you are just about to hit the range where it's going to drop off your credit report, and it very rapidly begins to diminish their capacity for collection. So therefore, that it's not within their best interest to do that. However, many of the times you're going to find that in many of the agencies, you're going to find that you have about a 20% chance that they will not go forward with providing you the information. A lot of collection agencies actually are really high up there on the chain of providing this information, especially if it was purchased from the original creditor. So once again, just some very important things to take a look at when thinking about going and giving a debt validation letter to a collection agency to have them validate a debt that you know is valid. Playing your odds may not be the best option. The best option may actually be to take a look at a possible settlement for a lesser amount. So, once again, I'm going to reiterate this. In the event that you feel that you know that that debt is not yours, you must validate it. You need to ensure that the debt belongs to you. This is only in the case of attempting to try to, well, basically flip the system on your side, and that's always a risky thing to do. So if you know the debt is valid, you need to seriously think about it based upon how much the debt is for, and how much easier it might be for you to have it removed off your credit report and just settle it for pennies on the dollar. So you know what it's worth in your time and your effort. It's a big deal for you to take a look at here. If you are debating requesting validation on a credit card debt, make sure to note that the FTC report did state that debt buyers were significantly less likely to report verification on disputed medical, telecommunications, and utility debt as compared to verification of credit card debt. If you're dealing with credit card debt and it was purchased, in other words, if it is a first or second tier collection agency that came straight from the original creditor, so if it's fairly new within the first 5 years, they're going to validate it. So you may want to take a look at settling versus validation, because once it's validated, it's there. You're stuck. You're going to pay it one way or another, or it's going to do a lot of damage to you, and could potentially even red flag it if you go to file bankruptcy. I know a lot of people feel that bankruptcy, especially Chapter 7s, are a given for every single debt, but believe me, there are a lot of creditors that will show up in court to dispute the bankruptcy. And if they can provide any documentation whatsoever that can be verified of income or any funds or any property that you own, personal, business, anything that you own that can be liquidated to pay off that debt, it's possible they may not be allowed to be included in your bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is not an absolute. You have the right to file it, and provided that you truly are bankrupt within the guidelines and regulations of the bankruptcy court, of course, that is your right. It does not mean that there are not particular circumstances that certain debts will not be granted as included to be discharged in the bankruptcy. So don't think for 1 second that you are free and clear just because you've decided to file bankruptcy. Okay, another piece of valuable information you want to take a look at. Now, there are laws in every state that require you as the debtor to dispute or request a validation piece of documentation from the collection agency within the first 30 days of being notified in writing by the collection agency. However, the same does not apply on the other side. Based on my experience, its range of when they would reply back to you with validation can go anywhere from about 6 days to possibly as long as 6 months, and sometimes even longer than that. And they're not required to provide you the validation within the same period of time as you are required to dispute the validation of a debt. And while it's true that they can't attempt to collect from you previous to providing the validation, after the validation has been requested within the first 30 days, including credit reporting, they can resume their collection efforts after they do so. So if you're sending a debt validation letter and that's part of your strategy to clean up your credit report because you're purchasing a house or a vehicle within that 30-day time frame, please know that it is possible that your credit report could be negatively impacted in the future if the account remains unresolved and is validated in the future, provided it's still within the 7-year reporting period. So if you're looking for a long-term solution to your situation that doesn't leave your credit vulnerable to future negativity, debt validation doesn't align with your goal in this case. All right, so that means that if you decide to dispute your credit on your credit bureau and they have not provided, the collection agency has not provided you with your validation yet, yes, then that debt would need to be removed. But in this particular case, because you have requested validation, that does not make the debt erroneous in the eyes of the credit bureau. This is the one case where if it happens to be your debt and it is validated to be you as the debtor, that actual credit reporting collection agency can throw that bad negative collection account back on your credit report for another 7 years. So you could be doing yourself a major disservice by doing it this way. In other words, as I've explained to you before, if something is found erroneous when you dispute your credit report, or it cannot be validated by the creditor, under those circumstances, if it's done through the credit bureau, then it cannot go back on your credit report. But if you validate it through the collection agency and it is found to be your debt, it can go back on your credit bureau. So once again, you just need to weigh out your options and decide what's going to be best based on what your particular goal is. Now let's listen here while Heather Allen of the FTC explains that consumers dispute about 3.2% of the accounts that are being collected by junk debt buyers.
In terms of the dispute rate, we found that consumers disputed 3.2% of all the accounts on which debt buyers attempted to collect themselves as opposed to sending out to third-party collectors.
One of the main reasons that you want to think twice before sending out a debt validation debt on a debt that you know is valid already is because it tends to draw attention to your account. The next piece of information is probably going to shock you. Most people assume that junk debt buyers and collection agencies collect a high percentage of the accounts that they actually service. But based on my personal experience when I was in the collection industry and a lot of the information that's been reported recently by the CFPB and the FTC, approximately 80% of all accounts that go into collections are never actually paid out. The reality is that junk debt buyers and collection agencies collect an extremely low percentage of the accounts that they service. In fact, just to put the 80% figure into perspective for you, it takes a full 7 years to collect the 20%, which means on a monthly basis, debt collectors only collect between less than 1% to a few percent of the debt that they are servicing. Most of the 20% that is collected within the first 12 months of the 7-year cycle. And when you consider these dynamics, I personally believe that your best protection is to mingle with the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of accounts that the collection agency or junk debt buyer is servicing, and to maintain a defensive rather than an offensive position. My point to this video is pretty much this, folks. If the debt is valid, you know that it's valid, and then you attempt to try to play the odds to validate a debt or dispute a debt that actually does belong to you. A couple of things could happen to you. Number one, with you zeroing in on your account, being that only about 3% of the accounts will actually request for a validation, when zeroing in on that, they may take a look at you as a possibility for a lawsuit, which is the last thing you want. Now, when you're dealing with a collection agency, you're generally looking at phone calls that are irritating and can cause stress, and letters that are irritating and can cause stress. And there are actually ways with technology as it is today to stop that from happening almost entirely. However, if you're starting to look at the possibility of a lawsuit, now you're dealing in a totally different area, and you're going to have to look at a lot more expenses. If you are validating a debt that you know is valid, that you know ultimately if they really looked hard enough, they'd be able to validate, then you're looking at wrapping yourself up really tight with that collection agency for at least a 7-year period. You are looking at the possibility of your wages being garnished if they choose to go and take it to that extreme. And there really is no way out of it since you have already requested for the debt to be validated and proven that it does indeed belong to you. So, if this is a cautionary tale for you, in the event that you feel that a debt is truly not yours and you have no idea where it came from, absolutely 100% of the time request that the debt be validated. But if you know the debt is yours, you know that it's valid, and you, regardless as to how you feel about that debt or if you think the amount is wrong or anything else, we're going to go looking at going about it a totally different way than you validating the debt because you already know it's yours. So I won't be going into any more detail for you about validating debts that you know are yours. That is a personal choice you will need to make. I simply wanted for you to know the downfalls that could be extreme in the event that you do that. What we are going to be looking at is either number one, the debt doesn't belong to you, or number two, the debt does belong to you, and ways to get rid of it and clear up your credit report that are legal and will not get you bound into the possibility of something that is going to cost you even more money and put you in even more debt. So this is just knowledge that you now have that will provide you with some education in what you may want to do when looking at each individual collection account. Hope this was helpful. Everyone have a great day.